Okay. So speaking of tempos, in the
Yes,
third movement,
this is
uh,
famous.
right. And so do you have a story or any information
Yes.
on why it's marked a quarter note equals 132?
Yeah, and that's a total misprint.
Right.
So, but here's the reason. It's an interesting story because that's just for when the piece was first published. That's what the score said, uh, published by G. Shermer, and it lived that way till the edition that you guys are using, Mr. Fennell's edition, came out, and it's still wrong. Um, but I do have a personal story about that because I finally, this would have been, I don't even remember what year, but it was the first time I went to Australia. I was in Melbourne, and so I was going to go the next day to the Granger Museum, where the manuscript score to Lincolnshire Posy resides. And there's a man by the name of Russell Hammond, who's like the godfather of bands in Australia. And he had set up a thing so that I was going to go to dinner with Russ and his wife and with Frederick Fennell because he was there in Australia for the first time. He had also never been to Australia. He was doing something different from what I was, but we were going to be in Melbourne at the same time. So he put this dinner together, and Mr. Fennell had gone to the Granger Museum that day. So he had already been. I was going to go the next day. And so I said, I was sitting in the back seat of the car, I remember, and I said, Fred, I cannot wait till tomorrow. I've got to ask now, the third movement, is it quarter note equals 132 or is it eighth note equals 132? And he said, eighth note, I'll change it in the next edition. So he was like really mad at himself because that mistake hadn't been correct. Well, unfortunately, he passed away before there was the next edition. So it's still wrong. Even if you buy the most recent version of it, it still says quarter note equals 132. But, the reason he always maintained that it was quarter note equals 132 is that that's what he did when he recorded it with the Eastman Wind Ensemble. And he sent that recording to Granger and asked him for his opinion. And Granger said, that's it. That's exactly right. So, there's that part of the whole thing too. But it doesn't, when you look at it and you say at the beginning, I think he says flowingly quarter equals 132, something like that. And then there's nothing else. And the next marking that Granger says, I think, is something, I can't remember exactly. But it says, yeah, it says slow off slightly, then quicken slightly, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, I do remember where the two versions come together. It says somewhat faster,
About
quarter equals 80.
right. Yeah.
Well, that's not faster than 132. So, I mean, it's, it's got to be eighth note equals 132.
Right. It's clearly not correct. Yeah.
Right.
So we're doing version A, and I've done this piece several times. I've never done version A. This is our first time to do that. And of course, I have my reasons why we're doing it. But do you prefer version A over B, and how do you make that decision about which version you'd like to do?
Okay, so I think now my preference, this is going to sound weird because now my preference, and I've never done it this way, but my preference would be to do version A, but use the soprano saxophone as the solo instrument.
Okay.
On version A. The, Granger in his preface says that he prefers version B because he prefers the sound of the soprano saxophone. Mm-hmm. But to me, the key relationships are just too abrupt in using version B. It just seems, I don't know. I just don't like the sound of it, even though I've done it several times. And I don't know why I never thought of doing version A, but using the saxophone until I was doing it the most recent time. And we had a wonderful trumpet player who was playing the solo. So it wasn't a quality issue, but it was sort of too late. We were sort of into the process when I thought about it. And I thought, I can't take it away from him because that sends the vibe that I didn't like the way he was playing it. And Miki Sasaki's a genius player. I mean, so there was no issue with that. So, but I did the mental file. Okay, the next time I do this, and there will be a next time because I do it every 3 or 4 years, So next time I do it, I'm going to do version A and use the soprano saxophone because the range actually works for the soprano sax. It doesn't go out of the range or anything. It would get a little low, but he liked that anyway. So
Right. That
yeah, I think I prefer version A, actually. Even though I'm more used to do, I have to think about version A more because I'm
yeah,
more accustomed to version B.
agree. Me too. I've
Yeah.
been doing B until this time. So
Yeah.
um, so now I want to ask you, because I heard on your recording, and we perhaps have talked about this before. As we're coming together, the two versions come together right before we have beam ba da dum dum and
Yeah.
the trumpets and also some of the lower brass with that as well. And we talked earlier about how Granger obviously knew how to write a rhythm.
Right.
He would write that out there. So often we hear that rhythm, that fragment performed, what I'm going to say incorrectly,
Hmm.
because the last two notes are supposed to be a 16th note followed by a dotted eighth. And
Right.
so many times you hear it more like a 32nd note on the downbeat. Ding,
Mhm.
da, da, dum.
Yeah.
So how do you interpret that, and talk to me about that?
So here's what I've gotten to where now I say to the group, okay, look, here's the way I want you to play this. And it's not the way it's notated, but I want it to sound bam ba da ba bam. So just play it like that. So, and sometimes people will scratch their heads a little bit and start thinking, ba, 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 I don't think that's right, but I don't care. I don't care if that's, I want you to play bam, ba, da, ba, bam. Just play that. So, because I want it to sort of be this sudden interjection, that comes out of this thing. So it's like a little fanfare statement. Um, and I think Granger was approximating anyway right there with that rhythm. So I don't know. I think I remember talking to Dr. Fennell about this also one time, about how precisely should that be performed, and he was like totally dismissive of that was because that was one that Granger sang him. Here's what he says. Granger sang him that rhythm when they got together and they talked about the piece. And I
Okay.
said, okay, so what did he sing? He goes, he sang dum ba da ba dum. So whenever I sing that to anybody, I'm trying to channel Frederick Fennell channeling Percy Granger.
Okay. Okay. So similar question then on the mordants and the interpretation of the mordants,
Yes.
which are obviously easier in some instruments than others, but we have several octaves going on all the way from the tubas in the lowest register
Oh,
to
I love that though.
yeah, oh, beautiful
Right.
spot and moment. And so do you ask them to interpret those mordants in a certain way, or do you ask them to play it like a triplet, or how do
No, I just try to get them to, and that I will isolate everybody who has that together so that we can hear it and just to listen to each other, but to tongue the beginning of the mordant, even though it occurs under a slur, for a lot of the instruments, if I'm remembering it correctly.
yes?
But so that the mordant, the attack of it is clear and that everybody is obviously playing it at the same rate of speed. Yeah, but that's because there's so many octaves involved in that. The thing about I'll make a general comment because it applies here at this moment, maybe as much as any other place, is how I think it's very difficult, but it is extraordinarily important, the dynamic shape of all these things. This is the dynamic shape of the canon, because if that's played really well, that should be this wild, crazy, oozing kind of sound where this, one pair of instruments comes out and then the other one is coming back. And so often you hear it played that everyone starts it softly, next group starts it softly, and then they reach a dynamic and then it never recedes again. It just stays that same dynamic level. And this is another place because he has this huge crescendo and diminuendo gesture that's written at this, what is this, 51 or something like that, where they come
Yeah.
together.
Yes. Yes.
And so I think trying to make as much of the spill over kind of crescendo, and then make the diminuendo on the other side so it relaxes rather than just getting up to a high point and then staying there for the remainder of it, which we often hear, I think. So I think the dynamics are super important. And the only reason I mention that is it makes the clarity of the mordant really important then, you know. So it just doesn't all get absorbed into this big miasma of sound.
Which is easy to do with the accompanying parts that are going there with the trumpet, multiple tonguing, and the different rhythms going on, especially as things start to disintegrate rhythmically a little bit later. So
something I did steal from Dr. Fennell about the trumpets, because I think this is right. And he would always say to trumpet players, when we get here to all of the rapid tonguing, you know, I don't care whether you play sixes, whether you play quadruplets, whether if you're a faster triple tonguer, that's great. If you're a faster double tonguer, it doesn't matter. You know, just play. But you're never going to play as loudly in rehearsal as you will on the performance. So that will be the first time we'll ever hear this full up with you guys playing just as strongly as you can possibly play. And I get it, so that, you know, that kind of weird energy that's coming from the trumpets, you know, on top of all this other stuff should sound like super fresh at the performance. Nobody's ever really heard it that way yet. You know, they've been playing it, but not, you know, with the kind of ferocity that they're going to give on the performance.
Good.
I kind of love that idea.
Yeah. Well, leading up to that, we have the underlying clarinet thing.
Yes.
Yum, bum, bum, ba-da-dum, bum. How pulsating do you want that to be? Do you want it to be more not static, but not a lot, not firmly articulated or rhythmically articulated?
I do want to hear it. I mean, and I want to hear the B D D B, you know. So it has a little energy, like a really suppressed and quiet, but a real intensity about it, you know. So I don't want to, you know, I think it's got to have some intensity about it, even though it's going to be soft, you know, so that the saxophone can. And there's another place where I think the dynamics are really important for them and for the saxophone, you know, on top of that. And that bar where it says linger.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one I always try to really stretch for both the first time when the trumpet has it and then later on when the saxophone has it.
Great. Okay. I'm just going through here. Any difference in the canon at the end in your approach to it and the one that we had at the beginning?
Not really. The orchestration's a little different. It's a different quartet of instruments, but I think it's the same thing with the dynamics being really important, their shape, so that we don't lose that. And it's easy to lose that on the one at the end for whatever reason. It's because everyone is kind of congratulating themselves on making it, you know. I mean, we've made it, we're here, it's about the, you know. But I think still the dynamic contour is super important, and it's not easy to do that last rallentando, the slow off as he calls it, you know, the last 2.5 bars there, and having that feel organic, so that it makes sense. That one I don't do anything weird to it. I just slow down, you know, in a proportional way.
So I have one more question about this. You've done it with several groups with lots of great musicians in them and accomplished musicians. And then, of course, there are a number of high school groups that have played this piece, but I also know a number of high school groups that have played this piece, but they always leave out the third movement because of some difficulty with the rhythms and not necessarily having the right people to be able to play the two canons. And I mean, it's hard and challenging in its own way.
It is, but it's a shame when that happens because they leave out the best movement.
So I totally agree, and I wouldn't think of doing this piece without
Right.
including the third movement.
So I guess those people are what, Granger says in his little note that says 2 band leaders. And he writes that, the only people who will balk at the mixed meters and the changing meters are those bandsmen who think more of their beer than of their music.
Yes. So that's not me then. That's good. Nor you. My question is, do you find that, like, when you did it with the Dallas Winds, do you find that they struggle more with this movement than they do the other movements? Are you finding yourself having to spend a little more time in preparation on it with them?
No, not these days. If there was a time, perhaps, where that would have been the case, but with the Dallas Winds, since the personnel is largely unchanging, except for the occasional person who leaves the group, and then we replace them with someone who's really good, usually, then this has kind of become a repertoire piece for them. I've got it programmed again for next season, so we're going to do it again next year. So that I don't think so. And the UT students are now, these days, as opposed to 20 years ago or 30 years ago, people are so now accustomed to that this is like almost child's play compared with some of the things that they will see. But what's interesting is, I think, I'm not 100% sure I'm right, but I believe that this is the first piece ever composed for band that made use of varying meters like this. Not that had meter changes or had asymmetrical meters, Flag of Stars and some classic band pieces did. But this is the first piece that I know of in the history of the band repertoire that uses mixed meters the way Granger does, especially in this third movement. So it was a groundbreaking piece in 1937, that's for sure.
Okay, let's move on. Movement 4.
Yeah, great. Another great movement.
Right, and great character and style throughout this movement. And again, with some great opportunities for soloists as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually want to skip towards the end of this movement.
Sure.
First of all, where we have the descending right before the little tag, if you will, but and the lower voices descending, which I find are often hard to get enough volume as they are descending and arriving at their bottom note. Other than making sure that the melodic content is not too loud to begin with, how do you address that in trying to get them to be strong in a double F down, and I think it's a low G?
Yeah, it's you're right. It's difficult even in the best of circumstances. And I try to not have actually the low reeds play as loudly as the trombones are going to play. I want the trombones to lead the sound there. And there's no other way to say it except they just have to tongue hard. Because that's the only way you can get. That's not a place for, as one former trombone teacher used to say, that's no place for Mr. Pa, 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 pa. So that's not, that needs to be aggressive, I think. Also, what's difficult too is right before that, and there's 2 spots where it happens. And because he changes the way it's orchestrated both times, and that's this famous getting that to be that I think are 2 of the most difficult rhythmic moments of the entire piece, to get those to work so that there's also a balance, so you can play it rhythmically accurate, but then it's very easy to miss the inner parts. And getting all of that put together is not so easy.
Plus, in the score, it's written, you have different instrumentation on it, but each time it's written with a different style marking on it. One time it's D, da, D, da, D, and the next time it is not that way, or maybe it has a 16th note rest in the middle of it. So
I always change all of that. I always make it all staccato and take out all of the tenutos, because I think, if when I can tell people are trying, they're trying to actually make the tenutos, and it just bogs it down and makes it really leaden sounding, I think.
Right.
Um, that's
So
why I've always loved Mr. Fennell's, that first recording of, that he did with the Eastman Wind Ensemble, which I think is so good. And this place just works so great in those recordings. I've always sort of had that sound in my ears, the one I want to emulate.
Good. The measure 42, which is the slow off, where you have the 16th notes on the E's and the U's, part of the B.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I hear some people doing it da 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 dee, da 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 with the true rallentando going evenly throughout the measure.
Right.
And then some people simply kind of holding the last beat, the last two notes for each part, with almost like a little fermata on each one of those, including not necessarily keeping a straight 16th note pulse through there, I guess is what I'm saying, and putting a fermata on the last note for everybody before they arrive at 43. Can you address that a little bit?
I'd like for it to be more organic, I think, than that. But I do slow down, and I always subdivide that bar. So we're going 1, 2, 3, 1 and 2 and 3 and 1, and then back into tempo. But so that it feels. It just, that way it feels logical to me to go back into the tempo. But I know what you mean. I've heard which I don't know, I don't like that.
Good. Gotcha. Okay. I mean, you don't have your score in front of you, so you may not be able to do this, but right where we arrive there at 43, we have a first and second clarinet, dee 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 da, and then the next measure, trumpet 1, ba dee dee da dee da, and then tenor sax, and in this Fennell score, it's trombone have it in the third measure as well. But in some of the other scores, it doesn't have trombone in the third measure. It has the trombone in the second measure. Do you recall what I'm talking about, or?
Yeah, and I wish, this is one thing that I remember wanting to get an answer at the Granger Museum, and you can't really tell because unfortunately the score that's at the Granger Museum is a condensed score with bubbles on it. It looks just like the G. Schirmer published score, except that it's in Granger's handwriting. So I don't know, that's a little bit of a mystery. I could see, you can make a case for it being both ways. The thing that I like to hear though is, because it's a little canon,
Right.
But I like to hear the trumpet, because that sort of Scottish snap isn't in any of the other parts. And so I like to hear the trumpet kind of come out of the texture for that before the where the clarinets and flutes are always out of tune, that place at the end.
And do you slow down the very ending there?
No.
You just straight 2 and 3.
And the reason for it is because it's gonna easy, bam, 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 rum, bam, because I want to go right into the fifth movement, and it would take the energy out of that abruptness, I think, if I slowed down.
Right. And it's not just because that note's probably out of tune and you want to stop it soon so we can get on to in tune notes.
It's either I've done, it usually works these days because the players are good and the clarinetists know that D is going to be a mile sharp, and the flutists, I always ask them no vibrato, just straight, so that for the C. But it's always, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. Because the clarinets are approaching it from below, and then they've got to land on that D, which is always high. So, hey.